I'm Diane. I'm the research, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the research director at the Parkland Institute. And it is my great pleasure to be facilitating this session today and to be at this conference, because it does feel like an incredible political moment for us to be talking about the ideas we're discussing here today. And it's fantastic to be at a conference where we can actually talk about horrible, unacceptable words like class and capitalism freely and debate them and talk about more than, for example, getting finance and corporate wealth out of politics, but actually tackling the power of corporate wealth and talking about collective ownership, collective action, and class. So it's really exciting to be able to have a free space to have these kinds of really interesting conversations and critical conversations for us as a movement. And for that reason, it's really exciting for me to be able to introduce the next two speakers, because they're going to be taking the conversation we had with Walden Bellow to the next step, which is bringing it home to Canada and talking about where we go from here. Both Alan Sears and Paul Moist have been not only public intellectuals and important thinkers, but also social activists. Alan Sears is in sociology at Ryerson, so he's an academic and a thinker, but he's also been involved in social movements in the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, in the there's a whole list of activist movements that he's been involved with. Toronto Stop the Cuts. So with social justice, but he's also authored numerous books. For example, a good book in theory, Retooling the Mind Factory, and he's currently working on a new book with James Cairns, The Democratic Imagination, Envisioning Popular Power in the 21st Century. So he'll be sparking our critical thinking abilities. And Paul Moist is the national president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which most of you should be familiar with, because it's a union that believes in social movements, supports social movements, works for universal social programs like healthcare, education, literacy, and poverty. and Paul Moist himself, of course, has also been a key activist in the front lines of social movements, working for change in those areas. So I'll start with Alan Sears. Great.
Thank you. I first want to thank the Parkland Institute for creating this amazing space for this kind of discussion. This is an incredibly important time for us to actually be talking about what we can do, why this is happening, and this is incredible to have a space where activists, community members, people from the university, students, all different people come together to begin this conversation. We're meeting today, I would argue, at a crucial moment. As we're gathering here in Toronto right now, a massive demonstration, which I expect to be one of the largest we've seen in a long time in the city, is gathering to defend Occupy Toronto. And the Occupy movement across North America in different cities in different ways is under attack. So on the one hand, we're seeing some fightbacks under attack. On the other hand, we are facing extraordinary attacks. We're facing, I would argue, the challenge of a generation. Unprecedented attacks on wages, on benefits, on working conditions, on pensions, on union rights, and on public services. We've been softened in many ways by the long wave of neoliberal attacks, but now they're coming fast and furious, and they're coming after us where we are in all kinds of different ways. People here know some of the struggles that we're facing. The goals of these attacks, I would argue, are pretty simple, and they're pretty brutal. Number one, to reduce the remains of the welfare state to rubble. Using user pay, privatization, either outright or imposing market models on institutions like universities and libraries and so on, and deep service cuts to essentially make services as they continue to exist so minimal that they will drive anyone who can afford it into the private sector. And essentially ruin the idea that we have any right, any social right to anything that we can't buy for ourselves on the market. And we're seeing this, it is expressing itself in different ways in different places, but that is pretty much the goal. So number one, reduce the remains of the welfare state to rubble. Number two, destroy what we sometimes call the good working class job once and for all. To get rid of the job that has decent pay, decent working conditions, often not ideal, but decent, job security, benefits, pensions. To reverse the great victories of working class struggles essentially since World War II and many earlier than that. And they've already gone very far in this direction in the private sector. Where many of the places where there had been good working class jobs in the past have lost many of those aspects. Now they're coming big time after the public sector to create an atmosphere essentially where we all feel that no job is safe. So remains of the welfare state to rubble, good working class jobs eliminated, and to thirdly, as part of attaining this, but as part of their goal in doing this, is to irreversibly weaken the union movement and our democratic capacities, our social movement, our activists, and our democratic capacities. And we're seeing that in all kinds of different ways, but one of the ways we're seeing it is simply the language that democracy is inconvenient these days. We're seeing this right now in Greece and Italy, for example. It's inconvenient to have these democratic figures. Why not have the technocrats who just do what the economy needs? And in the last election, Harper was talking all the time about a government that essentially can just channel the economy. That's what we need, and none of this, we can. So they're trying to weaken democratic capacities that will have a long-term effect. And they're in a position to be ambitious on their side, to be bold, largely because we are actually in a relatively weak state. And I wish I didn't have to say this part, but I'm going to talk about how we can rebuild. But our movements are actually in a relatively weak state at this point because of the cumulative effect of 30 years of neoliberal attacks, but also because of changes in working class life and in ways of work, and because of our victories and defeats over a long period of time. Our side is weaker, I would argue, to be a bit provocative, than it has been in many ways in about 150 years. What I would call the infrastructure of dissent, the networks, the organizations, the political currents, and so on, that help us develop our capacities to organize, to be effective, to fight back, is actually at quite a weak state right now. And what do I mean by the infrastructure of dissent? Essentially, for us to be effective in fighting this, in fighting whatever the challenges we're facing, we need to develop capacities to analyze, to communicate, and to act collectively. Those aren't things you learn in school. Those aren't things you learn without consciously beginning to develop those capacities. The capacity to analyze, because if we want to fight what's happening, we need to understand why it's happening. And that's not something we're going to get from the mainstream media. It's not something we're going to get in classrooms. It's not something we're going to get at a union meeting. It's not something we're going to get unless we actually develop the spaces to ask those questions and to debate it out, because we're going to have different views about why this is happening. But action needs to be connected to analysis of why it's happening. Secondly, the capacity to communicate. We need our own communication networks, not just relying on the mainstream ones, but we also need to develop our capacities to listen, because communication isn't only about speaking, to listen, to speak up, which certainly we're not taught in this system. Put up your hand gingerly and then speak up, and to write. And finally, we need to develop capacities to act collectively, so that we actually feel that we can organize and work together to develop an effective fight back. This was developed, these capacities were nurtured through much of the 20th century by an infrastructure of dissent that has eroded now because of changes in working class ways of life and ways of work. It was nurtured by a variety of different things such as the radical press, co-ops, oppositions in unions that had sustained caucuses and sustained ideas about fighting out about what the union should actually be about, socialist and anarchist organizations, various cultural spaces, co-ops, and lots of informal networks in working class neighborhoods. And I'm not saying there's none of this left. I'm saying it's weaker than it's been in a long time. So we face the challenge of rebuilding our fighting capacities at the same time as we're facing huge, huge challenges, momentous challenges, attempting to reverse essentially the gains of the last 2 generations. They're claiming they need to do this as a necessary, inevitable, and rational response to the global slump that has been in place since 2008. And I'm not going to go into an analysis of the global slump. People have already done that. But they're saying this is all we can do. The global slump was triggered by a financial crisis, which can sometimes lead to the misleading conclusion, I would argue, that it's simply about the financial sector, better regulation, more rational institutional structure, and so on in banking, and everything would be okay. I think that's part of the reason that you get people like Mark Carney from the Bank of Canada and Paul Martin yesterday expressing some sympathy for the Occupy movement, essentially saying, well, maybe we can clean up the financial stuff. It can be constructive. It can help us clean up our act a little bit. But in fact, the financial crisis has been the trigger for a broader economic slump, and those crises are built into this system. It's unable to produce sustained and steady profitability, which is what actually keeps the system ticking over. Throughout its history, there have been upturns and downswings, and we're seeing one right now. And the precise reasons for that and so on, that would be another talk that I'm not going to do. But their goal now is to restore profitability. And there's a number of different strategies that they're doing that we're beginning to see the price of. They came first in many ways since 2008. They first went after the private sector. And we've seen massive attacks in terms of restructuring and attacks on workers' rights since 2008 in the private sector. And the attack on pensions in the private sector has been huge, including, for example, the lockout of steel workers in Hamilton, claiming that the legacy costs, the cost of paying for pensions, is too much. In the United States, just to make sure people know this, through the 2000s, hundreds of thousands of retirees have actually had their pensions slashed and have lost health benefits, especially in the steel industry, as companies have gone out of business, declared bankruptcy, reopened under another name, and written off the pensions. So and now the Canadian steel companies are saying, oh, we can't afford the pensions. In the States, they don't have to pay for those things. So we're seeing this idea that we can't afford pensions anymore across the private sector, and massive elimination of pensions and so on. We saw right after, as the crisis hit, amazing ultimatums demanding that unions reopen agreements in places like auto, which had been, the automotive industry had been a strong point for unions to do immediate cuts to wages and benefits and to introduce multi-tier or at least 2-tier contracts, where this generation essentially sells out the next one. And these 2-tier contracts have brutal effects, I would argue, over the longer term in terms of union activism, because the newer, younger workers often feel that they're not represented by the union that represents the older, privileged workers that have the good deal. And often, in practice, they aren't represented because often they're part-time and have hardly any effective union representation. So it actually alienates the next generation from the unions, let alone the fact that it creates second-class employment and so on. So we've seen those ultimatums and the reopening of contracts. We've seen massive shutdowns and layoffs. And in the city of Windsor, where I used to live, the situation is pretty dire, but we've seen that in all kinds of places across the country. And the only kind of shifting over, even more than they have over a long period, towards part-time and contract jobs for any hiring that's taking place. Now, having done this, they're really, really coming after the public sector big time. It's a culmination of a long attack. We know it's not coming out of nowhere. Leo Panich and Don Schwartz have a number of editions of their attack on trade union freedoms book, documenting that this goes back to the 70s, but they're really, really coming for the big one this time. They're saying they're responding to debts. They have to do it. And it's really important to understand how much of this debt is actually banking debt that they've simply taken over, nationalizing trillions of dollars globally of bank debt as they've bailed out the corporations. And they continue to pursue aggressive tax cuts and then say debt's making us do it. But they are now vilifying public sector workers. They're saying that the last good working class jobs are in fact gold plate conditions that are unaffordable and they're jobs for life as opposed to most people who are feeling incredibly precarious right now. They're attacking job security, pay, benefits, pensions. First one in the private sector in many cases, and then spread as unions like CUPE grew to the public sector, and they're pairing this with a massive attack on social programs. So we are facing the threat of a generation. The huge attacks are here, they're not just on the horizon. And people who I know in the Toronto labor movement say, this isn't, I don't have it in writing, Paul may or may not know this, but that Toronto City Hall, the Toronto City Administration is moving towards a lockout of the municipal workers in Toronto, that they've already contracted with scab firms to collect garbage in the event of a lockout, and that they are particularly upset about the anti-privatization language that CUPE brilliantly won in the contract that says that workers who lose their job due to privatization get redeployed inside the city. They really want that out of the contract to make their privatization plans more viable for them. So this is just one sign. Everyone here knows of fights that are much closer to home than that. I'm just mentioning one that's close to my home. So now we face this incredible challenge. How do we defend good jobs, not as a privilege for the few? And this is one of the things that I think we have to talk about today, because it's not easy. Younger people right now, I think, are caught in feeling desperate to find a way in to something sustainable for themselves, and often feel that what they're seeing is a layer of privileged workers, us, me for example, sitting on the good jobs. And so they're worried about whether that's sustainable, and a lot of people say, as a taxpayer, I can't afford those good conditions. And at the same time, the same person can also say to you, but I'm also worried about whether there's a good job in my future or my children's future or whatever. It's a very contradictory moment, and we need to figure out how to play that. And that means that our activism these days, including trade unionism, it's always political, for sure, but this slump and the austerity agenda, the massive attack that we're facing, make it even more political than it's ever been. Or since the rise of unions in many ways. We need to find ways to create real solidarity that can challenge the divides, because they're running over us in terms of those divides. The divides between private and public sector, so that Windsor, Ontario, in many ways, a key place in terms of the rise of industrial unions in Ontario saw CUPE workers facing a brutal strike a couple summers ago with extremely low levels of solidarity. Shocking in a city like Windsor that had a real reputation as a union city, but a lot of the private sector workers said, we've made our sacrifices, it's your turn. We have to look at the divide between organized and unorganized workers. The divides between precarious workers and those with good jobs. And we especially need to understand that for many people, especially women of color, especially undocumented workers, but often workers of color in many ways, precariousness has been there for a long, long time. And if we're going to defend ourselves against precariousness, we can't make it sound like, oh, it's just for those of us who used to be able to hope for something better. But we need to talk about precariousness across the economy and how to fight it. We need to find new forms of unity between those who are employed and those who aren't, between those who are young and those who are older, between status workers and non-status workers, and semi-status workers, which the Harper government has increased dramatically in terms of changing immigration policies in Canada. Do this all in line with global solidarity. We need an integrative, queer, feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and ecological class analysis to do this. Because we need to understand that these things are always worked out in ways, just for one example, cuts on social programs, attacks on the public sector, all these kinds of things affect women's work, intensify women's work particularly. And we need to be able to talk about those things rather than suggesting that there's class and then there's social movements. We need to figure out how we integrate these things. And it means every action we take these days, we need to think, how are we fighting for public opinion around this? Every strike needs to be a battle around public opinion. And I would argue that, for example, the last Toronto public sector public sector strike a couple of summers ago was disastrous that way. I would argue the unions did not really have an effective strategy for trying to win public opinion, for convincing people that the fight of the municipal employees was also the fight for services, the fight for good jobs, and the fight against precariousness for all of us. They didn't even, in many ways, mobilize their own members to make arguments. If you visited the picket lines, a lot of people couldn't really articulate exactly why they were on strike. Aside from saying, well, they're trying to take away some clauses in our collective agreement. For someone who doesn't know the stuff, it's not very convincing. You need to be out there, you need to be conversing, you need to have strategies for this. But if we do it, I think that there's a real upside. If you look at polls that they took in Wisconsin during the incredible action there. If you look at what happened in Ohio a few weeks ago, and if you look at what's happened wherever people have gone into action, including the public response to the Occupy movement, a lot of people are really worried about our futures right now. And when they see a sign of a clear fight back, that really seems to show that we can take these conditions on, a lot of people who have those contradictory views I was talking about before can really be rallied on side. But we need to be quite conscious of doing that. Narrow trade unionism won't do that. We need to be thinking of new forms of democratic labor community mobilization in which labor activists, union leaders, rank and file workers, community activists come together. It's going to be messy. Lots of discussion and debate, lots of disagreement, lots of anger at times, and also some joy, hopefully. But I think that it's really important in this moment to be thinking of that. But I think we also need to look, there are important signs of rebuilding. And this is the last point I'm going to make. Important signs of rebuilding, and the Occupy movement, I think, is a really important part of it. We've seen these incredible struggles in places like Egypt and Tunisia, and I can't do any justice to that in the minute that I have left, except to say they didn't come out of nowhere. In places like Egypt, that struggle was a long-time struggle, including hard battles for union rights in certain places, long battles for democratic rights, but they came to the fore and got rid of a dictatorial regime that people didn't think that they would be able to get rid of. In Europe, we've seen general strikes and so on. Often limited 1 or 2 day general strikes, nonetheless quite amazing. In Chile, we've seen this protracted student movement. I don't know if people here have heard about it, where students have occupied many institutions and have mobilize in huge numbers in the streets against new neoliberal education policies. We've seen the Occupy movement not only spread, but have amazing impacts on public opinion. And this huge moment right now where the question is, what next for the Occupy movement? Because they really are under attack in places like Toronto. Amazing alliances are being built, but the challenge of how to build on that energy is something we all face. So, to sum up, we face this challenge of rebuilding our fighting capacity, rebuilding the infrastructure of dissent, and that means being conscious that we need not only activism, though activism is certainly crucial, but we also need to create the spaces to think, to analyze, to develop our capacities, to debate, to disagree, hopefully in comradely ways, to agree. That's also possible, and to align our demands and build movements that can actually build effective solidarity, an effective solidarity that defends, most importantly, the least advantaged, and focuses on those who've been most precarious for longest as a way to win the battle for all of us against precariousness, for social programs, and for a just society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. I do have a sense of affinity with Alan because he actually talks almost as fast as I do. I know when you have a narrow window of time, a lot of really important ideas. But that was fantastic, thank you. And now we move to Paul Moist from the Canadian Union of Public Employees.
Thank you, Diane, and good morning, everybody. I want to echo Ellen's comments and thank the Parkland Institute for hosting again another weekend of thought, and we're proud to work with the Parkland Institute. Look in early 2012 for a major piece of research and attendant discussion on long-term care here in Alberta and across Canada. And Parkland is one of about 6 Canadian civil society groups that CUPE uses some of its resources proudly to support. But I think the 2012 long-term care research is going to make a great contribution here in Alberta and across Canada. In terms of context, talking about the crisis from 2008, last night it was framed in a post-war time frame. I'll frame it from a public sector trade union point of view in a 25-year time frame of deregulation, privatization, and free trade. And the speculative economy, I agree with the comment Leo made last night. The financial oligopolies of the planet, centered in Wall Street and elsewhere, are in fact too big to fail. Their size has made their ability to cripple the world's economy. Finance capital can cripple the world's economy. In my view, I'm not sure any labor unrest at this juncture can or will cripple the world's economy. Since 2008, they have successfully socialized their losses, their paper losses, resisted regulation, and retained all of the private privilege. The bonuses are back, and the gap widens in our country and elsewhere. I say globalization in the past 25 years because they have successfully, in the West, in the so-called developed world, the OECD, they have driven down private sector union density, and they now have their sights set, as Alan and others have said, on the public sector. The Economist was, as always, subtle last January, and I think their cover kind of says it all, if it can be produced, because they are setting their sights globally on the public sector for two reasons. One, to pay the bill, and two, knocking down the last domino of trade unionism, or one of the last big dominoes of trade unionism. The public sector will fulfill a goal they've had for a long time. Last night, Leo talked a bit about global employment trends. These measurements are always precarious, I would say, but I watched an interesting team of labor economists and researchers and leaders at the World Bank and the IMF earlier this year. Once every 2 years, the global trade unions have access to the World Bank and the IMF. I never believed I'd be entering the IMF building in my life, but I did it. In any event, 15 million recorded unemployed in the United States as of January of this year. 50% of them 9 months or longer. The longest periods of sustained unemployment since the 1930s. 60% of the global workforce employed in some form of temporary contract or precarious work. That's in addition to the non-registered workers, the underground economy that was spoken about last night. A couple of other trend lines that are on the rise. Recorded, many more not recorded, 2 million workers dying each year on the job globally, 300 million injured, and the numbers are rising and have risen for the last 2 decades, every year. The attacks in the United States are well documented, and we have a keynote speaker, Stephanie Bloomingdale, tomorrow afternoon. So I won't speak to that, but I spent time in Wisconsin, and in a state where the union density across the board, public and private sector, is, I believe, under 40%, to have that sustained level of support coming to downtown Madison from the airport, staying at a hotel, going to a restaurant, going back to the airport, and having a sandwich at the airport. Every single worker, the taxi driver, the person working in the airport, was talking about what was occurring in the state legislature in Madison. None of them were unionized. All of them started the conversations when they would see you wearing a badge, the blue fist from Wisconsin. This doesn't happen very often, and this was broad-based and is broad-based. In Ohio, I think the number given last night, 62% have rejected by plebiscite the elimination of collective bargaining in a state where there is, across the board, 33% union density. That's counting the public sector, which is far more unionized. So we have much to learn from the fight back that Stephanie will talk about tomorrow. In the European Union, prior to the most immediate crisis, which has the euro, in my opinion, on the bubble, and the EU zone itself very much in doubt, I learned traveling the country in the last year with Maud Barlow on the CETA tour, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. Much of the social contract has been destroyed in Europe a long time ago. Most major public services are in private hands and delivered privately. Most water systems, most transportation systems. There has been a steady and sustained and ongoing privatization of what we would call the public good here in Canada. Most of Canada's water systems, etc., remain in public hands. In the United Kingdom, the so-called big society, it's ground cover by a minority government for ripping up public services and placing work in the realm of volunteerism, public services. Legislated pension reform will have on November 30th between 2 and 3 million public sector workers on a one-day strike over imposed austerity in the public sector pension plan. Maybe the most significant words I heard from a trade union leader, maybe in many years, but certainly this year, was a Romanian trade union leader, the equivalent of the Canadian Labour Congress president, speaking to Mr. Strauss-Kahn when he still occupied his position at the IMF, asking how on earth the conditions attached to relief in Romania, 50% reduction in social services such as they exist in Romania, mandatory deficit reduction to 5% of GDP, and a 5% hike in the value-added tax, plus a permanent 25% wage reduction for all public employees in Romania. And to the conditionality, I've read about the conditionalities imposed upon Africa, as you have, and imposed around the world, but to listen to a trade union leader with his economist confronting the IMF, this is the tip of the iceberg of the space being given to capital, because when things get really, really bad, those conditions will and are going to be imposed on Italy as well, and many other places. So back to Canada. What does all this mean for us in Canada? We now live with a strong, stable, conservative majority government. And to quote a certain person, well, it's meant instantaneous attacks on the public sector, postal workers, attacks on private employees of airlines represented by two unions, ours, CUPE, and the auto workers. It's ignoring the wishes of grain farmers in Western Canada, the elimination of the wheat board as we know it, opposition to a financial transactions tax around the globe. Canada is the most vigorous. The reputation of Canada around the globe is far, far right of where it was, and it's never been particularly left. The gun registry is, I believe Mr. Harper's determined that he can retain a majority in Canada without the province of Quebec, because the reaction in Quebec is visceral to that. And a few series of smaller things. Bill C-17, the first private member's bill introduced by a conservative member, innocuous, more accountability. Trade unions should report their finances in a much more comprehensive way for publication on the government website. That has nothing to do with accountability or transparency. The penalty would be loss of a tax-free status for union dues. Every year, 4 million Canadians on their tax form or get a tax advantage on the union dues that they pay to their union. This has nothing to do with taxes or transparency. This is Harper stepping around one of the first decisions under the Charter, the Levine decision, where the right wanted to attack the use of union dues for things other than collective bargaining and servicing the members and filing grievances for them. Levine argued, an Ontario public employee, that one should not be allowed to use any portion of his union dues for so-called political action. The Supreme Court disagreed. Harper wrote about that as head of the National Citizens Coalition, and they will retrieve. C-17 has been struck down by the Speaker. Private members' bills in Canada's system cannot have money matters attached to them. It'll come back in another way. His goal is not simply the trade union movement in Canada, it's to reshape our country, but union rights will be collateral damage in the next 4 years. The global context has been spoken about. It constantly amazes me, but in our national convention 2 weeks ago, I spoke about these tipping points, some of which were touched upon last night and this morning, about in Syria, Hamaza al-Khatib, a 13-year-old, brutally murdered. His body returned to his family a month later. His crime, he went to a demonstration with his father. And the reaction in Syria is playing itself out as we speak, and it will conclude with the toppling of another domino in that area of the world. Tunisia, spoken about last night, Mohamed Bouazizi setting himself on fire. And in Egypt, the beating death of a fellow in a 28-year-old in an internet cafe was a spark there. So there's kind of massive citizen response driven by new ways of communicating through the internet and the media. I'm convinced of the 2,000 CUPE delegates who were sitting in Vancouver 2 weeks ago, most had not heard about this. We live in an age of unlimited abilities to communicate with one another. And I would argue, historically, in a Canadian context, there's maybe never been a period of time in workers' history in Canada when there's less class consciousness of workers being workers. And I don't say that to be critical of any delegate at our convention. It was a revelation to many people that these tipping points, these single incidents, were, among other things, lit a flame in the Middle East and the Arab world. What's the key? What's the question that arises for me out of this? Will workers' rights increase in the wake of all of this? What will the next regime be in Egypt? A softer form of military dominance? It remains completely unclear what the reaction to citizens' responses will be. I will measure it, among other measuring devices, on the rights, if any, that are extended to workers, because workers expressing their rights collectively is one of the only ways to get at this struggle that we're all struggling with. So looking forward, on the theme of the attacks on unions and democracy, while the gap is widening, it's well documented between haves and have-nots, the 1 and the 99. When I look at it globally, one of the privileges of this job that I hold for now is I look at India and China. Everybody writes about the GDP growth in India and China being unbelievable for the last decade and continuing, measured against much of the rest of the world, to be very good. So there's rising GDP, there's rising wealth in China and India. There's no rising of workers' rights in either of those countries. In fact, there's a diminishment of rights in China, if that's possible. 7 times in the 8 years I've held this position, the Chinese government, through their agents, who are the state-run unions of China, are begging us to come on missions to China to give credence to that form of state trade unionism there. I only went to mainland China once, not as their guest, but from Hong Kong. And it's difficult to get into mainland China from Hong Kong. But we met with workers. Workers in a secret place, workers afraid to run for office in their state union elections. And they categorized for us, and we support a coalition that operates under a different name. It doesn't purport on the title to act for workers. So I won't mention the coalition because that would be problematic for them. About how there are no rights in the workplace, about how maimed and injured workers, there's no advocacy, there's no process to realize their grievances. So China's rising, and the world is, even our Prime Minister is stopped his rhetoric a bit about China. But if globally the areas of growth, as the previous speaker on Skype talked about, are in Asia, GDP growth, there's no corresponding rise in the rights of workers in those countries. There's been no re-regulation of capital since 2008. The speculative economy is intact. Leo touched on this last night. I have a broker of all people who likes to meet with me at times saying the next domino that drops will be far worse than 2008. World GDP on an annual basis, $60 trillion. About a quarter of it remains the US economy. Derivatives, hedge funds, off-book instruments that funnel globalization, $600 trillion. So when those dominoes start to drop, those losses have to be parked somewhere. And I don't think we would disagree in this room that it will get parked with workers invariably. And in the West and in the developed world, it'll be parked with massive cuts to public programs and continue attacks on services. And at the end of those services are workers. It's a fundamental mistake for any trade union, a public sector trade unionist, to talk about the attack on the workers. The attack on the services is the attack on the workers, ultimately. In your newspaper today in Edmonton, it's a micro kind of a story. You needed snow clearing resources to respond in the last 24 hours. 70% of the contract snow removal forces didn't respond in the last 48 hours. Why? They were busy doing their private work first. So the city says in the newspaper today they're going to deal with that by speaking to them. So I feel comforted by that. In any event, to go back, just a couple of more global comments and then some specifics on a trade union response here. Joseph Stiglitz, former World Bank chief economist, he talks of government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. Naomi Klein made one of the first speeches in Occupy Wall Street, without a microphone in the manner that's being used. She talked about the new normal being serial disasters, both economic and ecological. And she's bang on this point. The 1% loves a crisis. When people are panicked and desperate, it's the ideal time to push through, in her words, privatization and the slashing of public services. James Surowiecki writes in The New Yorker, I think he's wrong, but he certainly has a perspective that gives pause for reflection. The Great Depression invigorated the modern American labor movement. The Great Recession has crippled it. And I hope that he's wrong, but we need to read those things and we need to reflect upon them. So why the gloom? Why is there this gloom? Well, citizens are gripped by fear. Every room of folks I talk in, university classes, union crowds, sometimes business crowds, mixed crowds, I ask the question, is there anyone in this room that doesn't have a member of their family or their circle of friends or their neighbors who is stuck in a shit job, who works really hard, is a good worker, but has a job that's lousy? And there was a time when there might be very few people in the room who knew anyone like that in their close circle. Everyone in this room right now knows somebody like that, who's stuck in marginalized work, and there's not really a prospect of getting out of that marginalized work. So when people are gripped by fear and uncertainty and paycheck to paycheck, and the increased use of food banks is not by people, not workers not working, I agree with Leo, people not working are workers. But the greatest growth in food banks across Canada is people that are working, who simply can't make it every 2 weeks. The General Motors Chrysler bailout was as unpopular as the Wall Street bailout in North America. People were upset at the GM Chrysler bailout. Well, those people make too much money, because that was what was fed to them by mainstream media. Mayor Rob Ford in Toronto was elected by this culture of fear. His popularity is following. That doesn't help Toronto Civic employees 36 months in advance of the next election. But fear and anger put him in office. I was briefed by a series of focus groups done in Toronto recently where you had to identify yourself as somebody who had voted for Rob Ford. And so we had people behind the glass watching these focus groups. The people that voted for Rob Ford have two politicians in the last 2 years that they voted for that they really admire. Rob Ford and Jack Layton. So all conventional wisdom about, voting trends and all that, Ford voters, the male focus groups, 35 to 55 or 60, the core voters for Rob Ford. What's the most serious thing Rob Ford has done wrong in the last year? So these are his supporters. Many of them, still support him. I found this astounding. I found it encouraging, actually. He didn't attend the Pride Parade in Toronto. People change, societies change. I dare say some of those focus groups are full of homophobic white men between 35 and 60, but they believe it's an appropriate thing for the mayor to attend the Pride Parade in Toronto. My point is, people have values, and tapping into those values is the way out of this mess. But when people are fed thin gruel by the Tea Party, by the Rob Fords of this world, sometimes they chew on that gruel and they act out against their fellow workers. I saw a thing in the Globe the other day. Every day in the Globe on page 2 they have some event in history and a picture of it. Well, the fall of the Berlin Wall was in there 2 days ago. It was talking about the Czech Republic, and you know the first president after that was Václav Havel, and he had mixed results. But here's a guy that was in jail in October of '89 under house arrest, was in the streets in November 1989, was elected president in December 1989, and spoke for the first time to the country in January 1990. We live in a world where things can turn real fast. What did he say in that first address to the people of the newly free people of Czechoslovakia? We live in the postmodern world where anything is possible and nothing is certain. That's a true statement at the level of the workplace, and it's a true statement globally right now. There is no certainty, and that drives fear for people. How do we turn that fear? And I'll end on that, because I think fear can cut both ways. People can retreat, trying to survive, and look inwards and just get into their own community and their family and try and survive, or they can revolt and protest and assert collective expression to their grievances. And Occupy Wall Street is a spark. It's unclear if it's going to burn as a bright flame. There's all kinds of questions being asked, but there's been more discourse in mainstream and other media about what's wrong in the world since the Occupy Wall Street movement began than I recall in the last 30 years of working in the movement that I work in. So Canadian Labour, organizing, bargaining, servicing members, that is a raison d'etre of organized labor, but we will die if we isolate ourselves to those functions. CUPE, it remains an enigma, formed 48 years ago by a forced merger by the Canadian Labour Congress, a good service in my view formed by the Congress. And the growth rate, day one there was 70,000 permanent employees, permanent workers in CUPE. Since then, the growth rate is 1,000 members a month for the last 580 months, for the last 48 years. And including for the last 8 years, since I've been president, we've added almost 90,000 members. So it kind of bucks a trend out there. But what do we do with that growth? What do we do with those resources beyond organizing, bargaining, and servicing the members, which we must do? Well, we need to do things like the Parkland Institute's long-term care thing. The CETA tour with Maud and myself hitting our 20th and 21st cities in a couple of weeks. There's no other group in Canada talking about the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement and a whole bunch of other things. At our recent convention, we talked about the capitalist system being broken in a policy document. We talked about supporting Occupy Wall Street. We talked about building a class analysis into our education work, about struggling on a larger plane, not just contract by contract. We will get murdered if we end up on the street with any employer over the issue of that pension plan or that sick benefit plan. Things we must defend, and we may end up on the street over them, but we must go on the street, if need be, with massive amounts of support from Canadians who want a public library system, who want public water. Today in Abbotsford, a small community in the Fraser Valley, okay, I'll wrap up. People are in a plebiscite. Do they want $66 million from the Harper government to expand their water treatment, or no? And you have to take it as a public-private partnership. And I believe they're going to vote no to that, as the people of Italy voted in July. But it takes a lot of work within the community to get people to reflect on the merits of public water. So we can't focus only on our members. We must increase our relevance to average citizens. Global union density and Canadian union density must increase. I don't believe there's any other efficient way to distribute wealth from employers to workers or societal wealth into public services than to have resources and the ability to fight for that. And trade unions are a key way to do that. So globally, I think workers and citizens want progressive leadership. They want space and opportunity to force real change, to discuss that change, to challenge institutions. And the goal for the trade union movement is going to be to embrace the legitimate aspirations of those from outside of the trade union movement, and for the trade union movement to fully become part of the demands of the 99% and continue to struggle with them, with our resources and with our feet.
Thank you very much, Paul. Both our speakers today have both mapped the scale of this attack of a generation, the magnitude of that attack, which I hope has galvanized certainly myself, but those others in the room, for the second piece of what they accomplished, which was to map not only the challenges of our infrastructure of dissent, but the possibilities for rebuilding that infrastructure of dissent. So we'll take questions. Hopefully we can find a good balance of gender as well in this section. So please put up your hands. You got it. Start here.
Thanks. I'll put this out to anyone who wants to answer it. On the topic of the infrastructure of dissent and communications, we have venues like the Parkland Institute, online media organizations like Rabble and the Tyee, but what proactive steps can Labour take to establish presence of left media in Canada? What conversations are taking place and what can be done?
I'll take two more questions. I'll go up to Elizabeth.
Good morning. Elizabeth Ballerman. I'm the president of the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, which represents about 22,000 health professionals in this province. Thank you very much for those words. One of the things that we've been struggling is to increase awareness among our membership that what we need to do is more than just the collective bargaining, that if we do that at our detriment. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about, over the years we have done a good job of raising wages to pretty darn good levels, raising the standard of living for our members, which then allows them to be part of, I've got the second car, I've got the cabin in the woods, I've got debt coming out of my ears, all of which create more uncertainty and from where I sit, perhaps more reluctance to think beyond themselves and beyond their own interests. And the idea of how we get people to start to think and understand what you've said. They've gone after the private sector, they're coming after us, and we've been trying to bring that message to our membership, and any and all ideas are greatly welcomed as we try to push that message forward.
Hi, I'm Jason Rockwell with the Machinist Union. My question, I guess, is more specific for Alan. It really has to do with, you mentioned that we need to retool for this fight. And I guess my question is, this attack, as you mentioned, is coming very rapidly and very broad. So what do you see as immediate steps for that retooling? Like what steps should we take, I guess, in a broader sense, as the left? And I guess what steps, this question could be for Paul, what do you see as immediate steps for the labor movement in and of itself to start retooling for this fight? Because I don't know if we have time.
Great. So I'll just say a few things in terms of that, though I don't promise complete answers to these wonderful discussions. Paul will say more, and then we'll carry on the discussion. I want to make sure that we don't steal all the time. I'm going to start with the communications. I think one of the things is when we think of communications, often our first reaction is, well, that I'm saying we need more progressive media, and I'm certainly in favor of that. I actually think when we think of communications, though, it's not only about media. Some of it can be about, for example, thinking about how activism communicates. So I think one of the most effective, and Paul was saying this before, and Leo was saying it last night, one of the most effective forms of left communication that we've seen recently has been the Occupy movement. That's opened up questions in new ways. And I think we need to think of that, but I think we also need to think about how we develop our capacities in many ways to speak out, to write, like generalize those capacities in different ways. I don't have any kind of secret formula in terms of this. But I do think that we need to look at the importance of that situation. I think it's an interesting situation where the internet has both created a lot more possibility for horizontal communication, and I find, seriously, on Facebook, I hear stuff that's happening all over the world in ways that I would not have imagined when I first made jokes about Facebook. And yet, we have to, what we're losing, though, is the kind of investigative reporting, the kind of detailed stuff. And so there's a lot that we're losing at the same time. And I just think we need a lot more discussion of that. And I wish I had more specific answers. Paul may, and I hope other people here may. In terms of the health sciences and what to do, I think what you're facing is a huge challenge. I think, unfortunately, to be blunt, if you look at a lot of the unions that we have across the country, they are essentially empty shells. They have a structure, they have a leadership, they have empty membership meetings, sometimes building up a bit around contract time, hopefully, but sometimes not even that. And it's really a challenge to overcome that. So I really appreciate the fact that you're even thinking about it, because I think some people aren't. I think part of the thing is for people to recognize that they are in a particular position to actually influence the world. And when that begins to happen, you can suddenly see a different kind of interest in it. And I'll just give one quick example. I think people have other examples, I'm sure, from Alberta. But when the teachers were under attack in the Harris government, but they were doing huge restructuring of education, the teachers and the CUPE workers at schools across Ontario mobilized in a way that I have rarely seen before by anyone. And they use slogans like, our working conditions or our teaching conditions are your learning conditions. They directly linked in their work and the learning of students. And then they went on a massive 2-week illegal strike, and public opinion polls showed every day of that strike it got more and more popular, even though we all know school strikes are incredibly inconvenient for working people. And I think, I think thinking about how you link in, and I think Paul was talking about this, how you link in your immediate conditions with a bigger fight back about this. Now that's hard right now, but I think pointing to where things have actually turned around, the kind of fight back in Wisconsin, this kind of stuff may help, but I wish I had more complete answers. I think even discussing it is a great step. In terms of it being, I wish I agree with you, essentially, that we're in a situation where we're going to have to try to learn on the run, to try to get rid of some bad habits as quickly as possible, but understand we're going to be trying to play catch up to ourselves as we're doing it. I wish that weren't so, but I think one of the things we have to do is we have to find ways to desectarianize as quickly as possible. The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly that I'm on the coordinating committee of is an attempt to pull a broader left together, and it has succeeded a bit. It's disproportionately an older white male left. So we've got a long way to go in terms of who's in the city, but nonetheless, people are getting along better, working together more effectively. I think that kind of step of saying we have a lot of bad habits that are actually shooting ourselves in the foot as we do this. And I really think thinking about what labor community coalitions and activism means in practice, wherever we are, around the specific fightbacks that we're involved in, trying to put that into practice is another thing that I think we can do and learn from. Sorry if I took too long.
I'll go in reverse order. The brother from the machinist, the quick answer to what immediate steps can the trade union movement take? In my mind, I've operated at all levels of the trade union movement for 3 decades, and I believe that the disunity that exists within the ranks of the trade union movement, it's not popular to talk about it, but if that can't be turned around, there is no rapid response. And there's 55 affiliate unions in the Canadian Labour Congress. Either the economy or the movement itself will see some rationalization of those so that all trade unions have resources that presumably they'll use for social unionism. But the quick response would be unity around issues and unity within and amongst each other, which is easier to say than practice. Awareness amongst members, Elizabeth's question. It seems crazy, but we need to create spaces beyond 20th century structures. The structure of CUPE remains a monthly union meeting, annual conventions in each province, written materials to members' homes. Many of our members are far ahead of us on this. And we get unbelievable attendance at 8 in the morning breakfasts before a convention starts at 9:30 to create a space, no pro and con mics, to talk about issues. Like, why are we spending money on the expansion of the Canada Pension Plan campaign? Many CUPE members have a pension plan at work. Why will people come and participate more in a space that doesn't have pro and con mics and rules and 3-minute speeches and all that? And the final thing I'll say on awareness, flight attendants. There's 6,800 CUPE flight attendants at Air Canada. They're a global union. They're flying around the world at all times. Attendance at union meetings in the 4 bases in Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal is small. 3,700 of them function on a closed Facebook site, which isn't always full of accurate information, but instead of whining about that, in the last 5 weeks, I've had 5 virtual town hall meetings with flight attendants. We reached 3,400 of them. Of the 3,400, 3,000 of them stayed on the line 30 minutes or longer, which is apparently good. And we use that technology to speak directly with and to listen to flight attendants. It's interactive. And to survey them. You can pose questions online and you get the answer in 5 seconds. And then the last 2 minutes of the call are for them to speak to their leadership and our commitment to get back to them with all of their questions. So we created a virtual union meeting that we have to do things like that. First question, infrastructure, communications, how can we be proactive? Each of the instruments you mentioned, I know CUPE supports the TIE and all that. It goes back to my answer to the first question. If the trade union movement could discipline itself to say, we're going to support a single blank, whatever kind of media institution you want to create. And it's not just for the trade union movement, it's for the left. But all of us, whether we live in Newfoundland, Labrador, or BC, are going to support Organization X. We don't want to dominate it. We're going to assemble money and create it. We would have a better chance of honing, creating a gathering spot that would be relevant for many, instead of trying to create dozens of gathering spots, which is what you listed 3. I could list 13 more that we're all supporting. But in a kind of complex communicative world, we've not landed on one spot yet.
We have time for about 2 more questions. So I'll go here and over here, up there.
My name is Anne Goldblatt, and I'm interested in your analysis of where we are now and where we're going to be going in terms of the continuing pitting of the environment, protecting the environment against jobs. So the Keystone Pipeline being the most recent one. But I'm interested in your thoughts about where we're heading and should be heading so that we don't continue to have that as, are we choosing the environment, are we choosing jobs?
Okay, go ahead.
My name is John Oberg. I'm a farmer and cattle producer. Alan Sears, I was happy to see you mention the fight to retain the Canadian Wheat Board. And just to add some comparison about the theme of the conference, here we have a situation where the milk producers and the egg producers said, now, that's the wheat board. No, he's not, Harper's not talking about us, but as you see, as the whole thing develops, the wheat board's first, it's the low-lying fruit. After that, it'll be the milk board and the egg producers. So I can, you know, it's a class struggle, workers, farmers, but a lot of people often don't see it that way, and it kind of falls in line with You know, one trade union says, well, we did our thing, we're not going to help those guys. But I mean, we're all in this together, and it's what they're looking for, the corporations, as you all know, most of us, is they're looking for profit centers that they can grab a hold of, or to lower the benefits of working people. During the campaign, my brother is the chairman of the Canadian Wheat Board, so I have a lot more insight probably than most of you do as to what's going on. But just a point on education. During the fight to retain the Canadian Wheat Board, they had a town hall meeting, which was organized by the Canadian Wheat Board. 17,000 people participated in that town hall meeting. A lot of good information came forth. And I think that's a major problem, is that people that are in collective agreements don't know what the hell collective bargaining is all about, or you know, why they are organized. And that's going to be a continual problem that we're always going to have, is to educate the masses well enough so they understand why they have to quit voting for conservative governments. Thank you.
We do have room for one more if you can keep it really short.
Just regarding the last comment that Paul Moyse made about the unions getting together to support, you know, Group X as a news front. This is something that I think, yeah, that we, even for people have been commenting about how the Occupy movement is getting the message out, but a lot of it's being distorted by corporate media. And the only way we're really going to get an effective response to all the problems that we've been hearing about is if we have a unified independent media, similar to what Paul Moy said, but something that's available, you know, a daily newscast on the internet and maybe on campus and community radio, something that's kind of a Canadian version of Democracy Now! That's not just dealing with individual piecemeal issues, but actually a full spectrum newscast that can replace corporate media that people will go to instead of corporate media, that, you know, and which has an underlying corporate class analysis of these problems and of the problems of neoliberalism, and is able to deconstruct it during the newscast. You know, that is the only way we're truly going to stop this. So, I mean, that should be a major focus of the left in Canada, with groups like the Council of Canadians and the unions getting together to produce or create some kind of media like this and to promote it massively across Canada.
Just very quickly in reverse order, there is a lot of distorted media, and there are a lot of good endeavors within the trade union movement to take these complex subjects and put them into plain language. And that isn't the biggest challenge, though. The problem will be to get agreement amongst folks to give up a bit of their autonomy, so there doesn't need to be a CUPE logo on it. It just needs to be a communicative organ, whatever it looks like, that is progressive and left-orientated, and that is a struggle. I'm not being critical of my sisters and brothers or my own organization, but I've worked in this movement for a long time, and when I say that CUPE won't raid another union in Canada, it's easy to say. So I run into a local, let's say in London, Ontario, that's raiding a machinist local. Well, I need to have the fortitude within my own organization to deal with that local instantaneously, to put them under administration, to give the machinists back their members, even if the machinist members are mad and they don't want to be members of the machinists on that point in time. If we cannibalize ourselves as a movement, we can't grow. And I make that comment on the communications as well. On the wheat board, the gentleman that spoke on the wheat board is right. I don't know, probably a quarter of our 600,000 members work in rural Canada. On Monday night in Miramichi, New Brunswick, 600 people showed up at a public meeting called by City Council to stop the closure of acute care hospital beds in the Miramichi Hospital to make it a long-term care facility. There was some CUPE members there. It was the entire community mobilizing public sector jobs are all that's left in some rural areas. They're important jobs and they represent important services. In the Miramichi, hundreds of people have become convinced that they deserve a hospital, they should have a hospital, they should have paramedic services, and they want them. And they dragged their MLAs there, and 600 people gave it to them for 3 hours. And there was a, historically in the 50s, not so much now, but there was a synergy and a unity between small business people, farmers, and workers who worked in urban centers. That's, for whatever reason, been lost. Maud Barlow and I, as I said, we'll have our 20th and 21st town hall meetings, December 1st and December 8th. At every meeting, we have a third speaker. 10 minutes from Maud, 10 minutes from me, 10 minutes from another speaker, an hour, 90 minutes of discussion. We've had a farmer, we've had a student, we've had a gentleman, 80-year-old gentleman who told us the history of the fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador. Every space where we have a chance to talk, we need to broaden it out. And in our union, we spent a little bit of time in Vancouver talking about the wheat board and what that represents. That's the union for grain farmers in Western Canada. We need to recreate those spaces. Finally, is it jobs or the environment? Well, I hope collectively, trade unionists, environmental, progressive people don't get sucked into that debate. Is it jobs or is it the environment? I think the communication, energy, and paper workers have taken a strong progressive position about orderly development of oil in Alberta, production. Why do we have to ship raw materials down to the Gulf of Mexico? Why can't we produce product here safely with good unionized jobs?
So I hope this discussion can carry on at lunch and so on, because I think there's a lot more that we all need to talk about in terms of these. I want to start with the independent media and just say, I think independent media is important, but I also think sometimes we use that as a shortcut and don't think enough about the challenges of rebuilding political organization more broadly. And I think it's one thing, because I don't think that it's simply getting a message out to people, but it's creating the forums where people can work through ideas and begin to act collectively in new ways. And so I think really what we need to be thinking about are the spaces for discussion and debate around things like strategically, with this upcoming lockout of municipal workers in Toronto, how do we work together to link together the fight against the cutbacks and for public services and the attacks on public sector workers? And we need to get as many people as possible actually into that discussion and figure out how that happens. In terms of the wheat board and stuff, I'm far from an expert on this, but just from reading this stuff, at first, all I could think of when I heard about what they were doing is, this sounds irrational. How can it not make sense to have a system that assures supply and assures at least a sustainable return to the farmers? I mean, there's just something kind of logical about that, except if you believe, which they do, that they're happy to destroy agriculture as we know it. And essentially, I think underlying this is actually a goal to say global agribusiness pays way more profits over time and is way more profitable to the people who are really in power. And they're quite happy to see destruction of a farming system that has worked in many ways and can often be, it's not always, can often be ecologically far more sustainable than the model they're going for. So I think we all need to be supporting this. That means a lot more education. That farmers are a smaller proportion of the population than in the past, and there's a lot of education around these issues, certainly in a city like Toronto, where I am. At the same time, there's much more interest, I think, coming out of the environmental movement about food and quality of food and all that kind of stuff, and I think it's a real challenge to bring these discussions together, which leaves us lastly with the environmental question, because I think you're absolutely right. There's an old saying that power corrupts, and I think what we need to remember as radicals is that in fact powerlessness corrupts. It's when people feel that there's nothing they can do that they resign themselves to the crap. And essentially, the idea that there's something deeply wrong with the ecological situation that we're in, and that it's totally unsustainable and that it's getting way worse really quickly, is something that lots of people know and that showed itself politically for a brief period of time. And now they're trying to shut that down completely. And if people feel powerless, there's nothing we can do about it, then people get resigned and say, well, I at least better defend my job or my neighbor's job or whatever. I think we need to remind people of the tremendous power that we have and reawaken that. And as that begins to happen, suddenly all these concerns come to the surface. So when I've talked to some of the people at Occupy Toronto, for example, they're there for, people sometimes say, well, they don't have a clear enough demand or they don't have a clear enough ask. I actually think part of the beauty of the Occupy movement, only as a transitional thing, it's not the only way to organize, but part of the beauty of it is because it's asking the bold questions, people are bringing their own issues. And a lot of people I've talked to at Occupy believe in ecological sustainability is at the core of why they're in this fight. And so I think as people begin to feel that it's possible to fight, that the questions of injustice that open up become huge. And that's where we face huge challenges. We need to do it on the run. But I really believe there's all kinds of examples of things that are beginning to move. And we need to kind of develop our method to learn as we're running, because we're going to have to be running because there's a lot coming at us. So thanks for the discussion, and I hope we can carry it on.
Provocative questions, and then another round of applause to thank our two speakers. And I have a few announcements. Just a couple of things before you start jumping up. Lunch will be served immediately straight across the hall to our left. If you have a happy face stamp on your pass, that means you paid for it. Leftovers will be served by donation at 1 o'clock for those unfortunate not to have a happy face stamp. Also, I just want to mention that there's another opportunity here, Parkland Speak, on November 30th that hasn't been advertised, but I will be on a panel in Ottawa that Roy Romano will be introducing and Andre Picard interviewing and facilitating, that will be live streamed. Watch for information in your email about the session from Ottawa. And finally, if you have questions or comments about the conference, please do write them down and submit them. You can leave us. Yeah.